you are able to see the slide presentation as far as I can tell. All right, so I gave you this learning activity. If you recall, we were looking at where ATP comes from during a 30-minute run. So let's go through this really quickly. So we said for the first, if you take off on your run, for the first 4 to 6 seconds of your run, the energy comes from stored ATP. That's just ATP that's in the cytoplasm of the skeletal muscle cell. Then for the next 15 seconds, ATP is going to come from the creatine phosphate. It donates that phosphate group to ADP to regenerate ATP. But for the remainder of your run, that ATP is going to come from where? Aerobic respiration. Ooh, that's going to be too big for me to put in there. Well, for the sake of time, I won't type this out. But for number 3, it's going to be aerobic. Maybe I can do this quickly. It's going to be aerobic respiration. Remember, the stored ATP and the creatine phosphates just providing ATP temporarily until your heart and your lungs can catch up. So that's going to be aerobic. Respiration. And while you're doing aerobic respiration, it's very unlikely you're going to be able to provide all of the ATP from aerobic respiration. So there's going to be a little anaerobic respiration as well. Alrighty, so anaerobic right there. Okay, after you've completed your 30-minute run, your heart rate and your respiration rate are still elevated. This is because you have to pay back your oxygen debt, which consists mainly of what substance? If you said lactic acid, that is correct. The oxygen debt is repaid when lactic acid is converted to pyruvate or pyruvic acid. Pyruvate. And no, it doesn't fit. Which is then used to replace the stored ATP that you used up initially. And the creatine phosphate that you used up initially. Alrighty, some of the pyruvate is converted to glucose, which is then converted to the storage form of glucose, the polysaccharide glycogen. Okay, so this little learning activity basically summarizes what the sources of ATP are during endurance exercise. Okay, so at this time, I want to open up the floor for any questions. Any questions about, specifically about the muscular system? Feel free to raise your hand, or you can type in the chat, or you can, yeah, raise your hand, and then you can unmute your mic. Yes, pyruvate and pyruvic acid are the same thing. So you can use pyruvate and pyruvic acid interchangeably. I mean, if you really want to get into the weeds, I mean, one is like the hydrogen has been lost, and another one, the hydrogen hasn't been lost. But I mean, for all practical purposes, they're the same. Other questions? Okay, so the situation is I will be posting a muscular system quiz on Blackboard in the assignments tab, just like normal. However, this quiz is going to be different from previous quizzes, and I think this is how I'm going to do it for the remainder of the semester. I'm going to start giving you quizzes which you will take for mastery. What that means is I'm going to have a pool of questions, maybe say 30 or 40 questions, and the quiz will randomly select, every time you take it, it will randomly select 12 questions. Now, what this will allow you to do is to take the quiz as many times as you want to. You can take the quiz 50 times. If you would like, and what will be recorded is the highest grade that you make by the time the quiz closes. What this does is it allows you to assess, then figure out what you're understanding, what you're not understanding, and then go back, do some studying, and then come back. Okay? I should have that quiz up and running by 1 p.m. And then it will stay open until midnight on Wednesday night. Okay, so it's a little different from the previous one where you had 2 bites of the apple. Here you have as many bites of the apple as you want. It'll take your highest grade of all of your attempts by the time it closes. Okay. All righty. No. So the question is this a lab quiz? No. This is the quiz on the lecture material. Okay, so what we're covering now. Since you did bring up the lab quiz, let me remind you that you have a pre-lab for eye and ear this week. You have a quiz on joints and muscles from last week's lab, and you should also continue to complete the Quizlets, studying all of the previous labs and preparing for your practical. And the practical will be available starting today in preparation for your practical. Practical, of course, is next week. It will open on Thursday and it will at 8 a.m. and it will close on Friday at midnight, or 11:59 technically. You'll get emails and reminders about this. Okay. Also, I sent an email this morning, so make sure you're checking your email 2 to 3 times a week. I sent an email outlining everything that you should be working on this week. So what I'm saying here, you'll also find on the email I sent you this morning. Okay, since there are no questions, or no additional questions, we're going to continue talking about the endocrine system. As soon as I pull it up here. So we said that the endocrine system, just want to check to make sure. I assume everybody is able to see my slides here. Yes, okay, cool. Just making sure. So we said that the endocrine system is the slow controlling system. And to introduce the endocrine system, I covered this little table here that sort of compared the slow controlling system to the fast controlling system, which you're very familiar with since we spent about a week and a half covering it, the nervous system. We compared the basic functional unit, the organization, method of communication, route of communication, and the speed. I want you to note Particularly is that the endocrine system is much slower and it works through glands. And the endocrine system tends to control processes that occur over a long period of time, like growth and development, or processes that are ongoing and are related to homeostasis, like body temperature or blood sugar levels, etc. Okay, so the way the endocrine system communicates is by the release of hormones. So let's talk about what a hormone is. Hormones are substances that are produced by specialized cells. These cells secrete these hormones into the extracellular fluid. They then pass from the extracellular fluid into the blood, and then they are taking all over the body. What you're looking at here is the pancreas. This would be if we took a slice of the pancreas here and then we turned it toward you, it would look like this. Now, the pancreas is an interesting organ. It actually has endocrine glands and exocrine glands. Exocrine glands, if you remember, have ducts, and their secretions are moved via those ducts into the outside of the body. So the pancreas produces bicarbonate to neutralize acid, stomach acid, that it releases into the small intestine, and it also produces digestive glands. So there are, digestive enzymes. So there are exocrine glands in the pancreas, shown here in blue, that actually secrete substances outside the body into the small intestine. That's not what we're interested in. What we're interested in right now are the endocrine glands. There are these other glands within the pancreas called beta cells that produce the hormone insulin, and they secrete that hormone outside of themselves, outside of the cell, into the extracellular fluid, and then it diffuses into nearby capillaries, and then those hormones are taken throughout the body. Okay, so I'm going to play this video that illustrates how hormones work. Okay, now give me just a second to get this up and running. Oh, actually, I'm not going to be able to play this video. This video will be available later on Blackboard, and when it's available, I'll bring it to your attention. I've got to get it formatted, so won't be able to show you this video right now. But basically, a hormone is a substance that is produced by an endocrine cell. It's released into the blood, and then it's transported throughout the body, through the blood, to other cells. Cells that have specific receptors for that hormone are called target cells, because that hormone is able to target that cell and cause that cell to make changes. Okay? Hormones can only impact cells that have receptors for that specific hormone. You could almost think of a hormone like a key and a receptor like a lock. You know how a key can only fit in a lock that's specifically made for that key. Well, if a cell has receptors that are specific to a hormone, then that hormone can bind that receptor and cause changes on that cell. And that cell is called a target cell. However, if a cell doesn't have receptors for that hormone doesn't have an impact on that cell. Just like you may have a key, but your key does not fit the locks on my door to my house, so it won't allow you into my house. However, it does fit the keyhole to your house. Okay, so in that way, your house would be like the target cell for your key. So that's the functional definition of a hormone. It's a chemical produced by cells in the body that enters the bloodstream and affects and directs the activity of other cells. Now, as we're talking about the endocrine system, and we're going to be talking about a very important number of endocrine organs and the hormones that they produce. But one of the things that you're going to see very quickly is that many of what we call endocrine organs also produce have other functions, right? In this figure here, you see all these different glands that are endocrine organs, like the pineal gland, the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, thyroid, parathyroid, thymus, adrenal glands, pancreas, ovary, and testes. These are all endocrine organs. They produce major hormones. However, notice that many of them also have other functions, and they're part of other organ systems. For example, ovaries and testes produce the sex hormones. They're part of the endocrine system. However, because they're also involved in reproduction, they're also part of the reproductive system. The pancreas, which we already talked about, it is part of both the digestive system as well as the endocrine system, because in addition to producing some very important hormones, it also produces bicarbonate and digestive enzymes. So many of these glands are not exclusive to the organ system, to the endocrine system. They also have other functions and are in other organ systems. So just keep that in mind. I also want to mention that most cells of the body produce hormones or substances that act very similarly to hormones. In this chapter, we're going to talk about the more important hormones and the glands that produce them, but do understand that what you're going to learn by no means is an exclusive list. Your heart, your stomach, your small intestines, the liver, your kidneys, even the placenta in a pregnant woman, they all release hormones. Now, in most of these cases, in these examples I've given you, the hormones, we're going to talk about the hormones that are produced by these organs when we get to the cardiovascular system and the digestive system. I just want to make sure you understand that by no means are the hormones we're going to talk about in the endocrine system chapter, do that represent all of the hormones that are produced in the body. There are many, many, many others. In fact, pretty much every cell releases some type of hormone. And as an example, most cells can release a hormone or group of hormones called the prostaglandins. They're sometimes referred to as local hormones because rather than go into the blood and circulate throughout the body, they tend to move through the extracellular fluid to other nearby cells. Basically, what the prostaglandins do is they're sort of the way your cells dial 911. They're sort of like a local stress hormone. So if you have like damage to a cell, like let's say you hit your head or you cut yourself, the cells that were damaged release the prostaglandins. And what they do is they cause nearby blood vessels or capillaries to sort of become leaky, meaning that they allow more fluid to move out of those capillaries into the tissues. And they also will cause the nearby pain receptors to be activated, right? And of course, what does that do? That causes pain and inflammation, and sometimes fever. Now, what's interesting is for years, we realized aspirin blocked pain and reduced inflammation and also impacted fever, but we never really understood why. Well, it's because aspirin stops the secretion of prostaglandins and therefore reduces pain, inflammation, and fever. Now, this is not something you have to know. It's not going to be on a quiz or an exam, right? I'm I'm sharing this with you just as one, let you know how aspirin works, and just to make sure you understand that by no means are all the hormones we're going to talk about in as we go through the endocrine system. It does not represent all of the hormones produced by the human body. There are many, many others. Excuse me. Okay, so before I move on to the next topic, I wanted to see if there were questions. I know I saw, at least I thought I saw a hand raised here or question. So a question, are there toxins that mimic the shape of hormones and jam up the hormone receptors? Yes, there are toxins that mimic hormones. Sometimes your body even produces them. And many therapeutic drugs actually have the same, basically act like hormones and bind receptors and cause changes on the metabolism of those cells. Other questions? Make sure they're very specific to what we're talking about as I open up the floor to more questions. I want to make sure we stay focused. Okay, so no other questions. We will continue on. Alrighty, so we're going to describe the mechanism of action of steroid and non-steroid hormones, and we're going to list some effects caused by hormones. Okay, first, let's talk about steroid hormones. So the image here on your right, what you're looking at is this is a cell. This is the nucleus inside the cell. This is the DNA here. So just give you some context. All right, let's say we have a steroid hormone shown here in the little, I don't know, off yellow here. So what class of organic compound is a steroid hormone? Is it a carbohydrate? Is it a protein? Is it a nucleic acid? Is it a lipid? It's a lipid. What do we know about lipids and the plasma membrane? Just think about this for a second. Lipids can cross the plasma membrane by diffusion, right? They can just diffuse right across, right? Because they're very much like the interior of the plasma membrane. And so steroid hormones, when they come into contact with their target cells, they diffuse right across the plasma membrane into the cytoplasm, even into the nucleus where they bind receptors. So they bind their receptors inside the cell. And then what's called a hormone receptor complex binds directly to the DNA, and it turns on or turns off the DNA. So in this example, it's turning on the DNA, and you're getting a gene turned on, you're getting a messenger RNA, and then you're getting a protein produced. That protein could be another hormone. That protein could be receptors. It could be an enzyme. It could be any number of different types of functional proteins. The importance of this image here is it's showing you that the way steroid hormones work is they bind directly to receptors inside the cell, and they turn on or turn off genes. And that's how they impact receptor cells. That is how all steroid hormones excuse me, work. They bind directly to the DNA and turn on or turn off genes. Now, for all of the hormones, or most of the hormones that we're going to talk about, you have to know their mechanism of action, how they work. All of the steroid hormones work this way. Okay? They diffuse across the plasma membrane into the target cell, and they bind receptors inside the cell, and they turn on and turn off genes. Now, I said you have to know the mechanism of action of every major hormone we talk about. Thankfully, that's very easy because there are only 6 hormones that we're going to talk about that are steroid hormones. So all you have to do is memorize the 6 that are steroid hormones, and then you'll know, hey, these are the 6 that are steroid hormones, therefore their mechanism of action is binding directly to the DNA. Every other hormone is going to work through a different mechanism that we're going to talk about. So what are the 6 steroid hormones? They include the sex hormones. These are the hormones that are produced by the testes and ovaries. progesterone, testosterone, and estrogen. The other three are the adrenal corticosteroids. They're called corticosteroids because they are produced by the adrenal cortex. They are aldosterone, cortisone, and cortisol. So these are the 6 steroid hormones that we're going to talk about. Memorize these 6 as steroid hormones, and it's going to be very easy to answer any question I throw at you about the mechanism of action of a hormone. Remember, the sex hormones and the adrenal corticosteroids are the steroid hormones. Another way to remember that is that, hey, most of these end in "-one", progesterone, testosterone, aldosterone, cortisone. Then you just have to remember estrogen, and everyone remembers estrogen as a sex hormone, right? And cortisol. Okay, so those are the 6 steroid hormones. All of the other hormones we talk about are going to be non-steroid hormones. They're going to be composed of amino acids. Some are going to be proteins. Some are going to be peptides. Some are going to be modified amino acids called amines. Now, you do not have to know this level of detail. You don't have to know, are they proteins? Are they peptides? Are they amines? All you have to remember is that they're non-steroid hormones. You don't have to remember specifically what type of non-steroid hormones they are. So if they're not those 6 that we just listed, they're non-steroid hormones, and their mechanism of action is completely different. So let's look at that. All righty. So what do we know about amino acids? Well, they're charged, right? They're not like steroids. So they can't pass through the plasma membrane. If you recall, charged compounds can't diffuse anyway across the plasma membrane because they're charged. Okay, so they're going to have another way, another mechanism of action of affecting their target cells. So let's look at that. So here's another figure showing mechanism of action, this time of a non-steroid hormone. Here we have our cell. Here we have our cytoplasm. Here is our non-steroid hormone. It could be a protein, it could be an amino acid, an amine, it could be polypeptide. It doesn't really matter as long as we know it's non-steroidal. So it can't pass through the plasma membrane because it's charged. So how is it going to impact what occurs inside the cell? Well, it's going to bind its receptor on the outer surface of the plasma membrane. And then it's going to cause a cascade or a series of events to occur through the plasma membrane and into the cytoplasm, right? It binds to its receptor. Its receptor then turns on an enzyme, and that enzyme ends up catalyzing a reaction that makes a second messenger. In this example, cyclic AMP. Now, you don't have to worry about knowing cyclic AMP. What's important here is that you understand that a non-steroidal hormone binds to receptors on the plasma membrane and causes the production of a second messenger inside the cell. Second messenger, what is that? Well, a second messenger is like a gopher. You ever worked a job where the boss just gave you things to do? Go for this, go for that, right? You can sort of think of the second messenger as like a gopher. The non-steroidal hormone can't get into the cell to cause changes in the cell. So it's basically saying, hey, second messenger, do my bidding. Do what I need you to do. And that second messenger makes some type of changes inside the cell. That second messenger can turn on enzymes. It could turn on genes. It could turn off genes. The bottom line is the second messenger is causing changes inside the cell in response to the non-steroidal hormone binding the receptor. So non-steroidal hormones work through second messengers. They do not bind directly to the DNA inside the cell. So knowing that, any hormone that I give you, you should know if it works through second messengers or if it binds directly to the DNA, just by memorizing those 6 non-steroid hormones. If it's not progesterone, estrogen, testosterone, cortisol, or aldosterone, it's a non-steroid hormone. If it's a non-steroid hormone, it works through second messengers. So if I say, hey, what's the mechanism of action of insulin? Works through second messengers. What's the mechanism of action of growth hormone? Works through second messengers, so forth and so on. Okay? Now, there is one exception. There's always an exception, right? And that exception is thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone is a non-steroid hormone. In fact, it's an amine. However, it does bind directly to the DNA and cause changes. Well, how does it do that? Well, our cells have special thyroid hormone channels. So it allows thyroid hormone to actually cross the plasma membrane and enter the cells. But this is the only exception, thyroid hormone. Okay, so you can add thyroid hormone to that list of 6 steroid hormones when it comes to knowing the mechanism of action. Now, I want to reiterate that hormones only affect cells that have receptors for those cells. In other words, for those hormones. In other words, the target cells or organs have receptors for specific hormones. So what can be some of the changes that occur when a hormone binds to a receptor? Well, and this is not an exclusive list by any means, but binding receptors by a hormone can change the plasma permeability of that cell. It can open channels. It can close channels. If it opened sodium channels, it could change the electrical state of that cell. It could depolarize that cell, for example. Hormones, when they bind their receptors, can turn on the synthesis of proteins like enzymes, or can synthesize proteins that act as channels in the plasma membrane or carriers. They can activate enzymes. They can deactivate enzymes. They can also stimulate mitosis. If you remember, we said that what the chemical messenger that causes a cell to know when it's time to divide are hormones. So those are just some of the changes that can occur in response to hormones binding their receptors on their target cells. Okay? All righty. I want to pause, see if there are any questions before moving on. Any questions? This would be the time to ask. Feel free to raise your hand. Okay. Well, we're going to continue on. All righty. So we're going to describe the 3 types of stimuli that cause release of hormones. We're going to describe how most hormone secretion is regulated. So what turns a hormone secretion on or off? Well, that's a stimulus. There has to be a stimulus that causes a hormone to be released. Remember, a stimulus is nothing more than a change. Now, if we were to look at every stimulus that causes the secretion of every hormone, the stimuli could be categorized as one of the following: either nervous stimuli, hormonal stimuli, humoral stimuli, those are substances in the blood, or hormonal stimuli. So in other words, hormones are released due to changes in the nervous system, changes in substances in the blood, or if there's a change in some other hormone in the blood. Let me give you some examples. Okay, so here we have, this is an example of a neural stimulus. So your adrenal medulla releases epinephrine and norepinephrine in response to nervous stimulation from the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, sympathetic nervous system sends action potentials to the adrenal medulla and causes the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine. What you know is adrenaline and noradrenaline, right? That's an example of a neural stimulus causing the release of a hormone. Some hormones are released in response to changes in the levels of some substance in the blood. For example, the parathyroid glands release parathyroid hormone when blood calcium levels drop. Because the stimulus is a drop in calcium levels in the blood, this is an example of a humoral stimulus. Okay, a humoral stimulus is a change in some substances in some substance in the blood other than hormones. Another example, which you may be a little more familiar with, is insulin. Insulin is released in response to what? Do you know? A rise in blood sugar. You eat a meal that has carbohydrate, which is pretty much every meal that we eat. Blood sugar levels rise, and in response, your pancreas releases insulin. So insulin is released in response to a humoral stimulus. Lastly are hormonal stimuli. Some hormones are released in response to changes in blood levels of other hormones. So one hormone actually caused release of other hormones. Here's some examples, and I give you these examples to help you understand, right? These are not something you're expected to know right now, but your gonads, testes or ovaries, release sex hormones, right? Well, they release those sex hormones in response to hormones from your anterior pituitary gland. Your adrenal cortex releases hormones in response to hormones from the adrenal cortex. Same with your thyroid gland. Because these hormones are released in response to other hormones, the stimuli that releases them is a hormonal stimulus. Now later on, you'll learn exactly which specific hormone is responsible for targeting the thyroid and the adrenal cortex and the gonads. But for now, just understand that hormones are released in response to other hormones, and that'll be a hormonal stimulus. Okay? Also, there's a term I want you to be familiar with, and that is the term tropins. Tropins are hormones that target other endocrine tissues. A tropic hormone is a hormone that targets other endocrine tissue and causes the release of other hormones. So these hormones here, which I haven't identified, but you'll learn later, that are being released from the anterior pituitary gland that are targeting these endocrine organs are tropic hormones. Okay, so in review, hormones are released in response to 3 types of stimuli: changes in activity of the nervous system, nervous stimuli, a change in some substance in the blood, hormonal stimuli, or other hormones, that would be hormonal stimuli. Okay, so we are at the end. So before we go, I just want to tell you, please read in your book, in that the chapter on the endocrine system. Remember, you want to always stay ahead of me. So what I would recommend is in the endocrine system, read up through to the pancreas, which is on it says pancreatic islets, but that's the pancreas, which is page 323. That way you'll be certain to be ahead of me. Okay? All righty. So I'm going to end here. I will see you on Wednesday. Thank you and have a great day. Those of you who would like to have questions or talk with me, please stick around.